My mother-in-law set 7 places at the table. There were 8 of us. So Janet picked up June's plate, walked it to the laundry room and set it on the dryer like a thing to be stored. She thought a 7-year-old was the easiest person in that house to move. By the end of the night, she would be the one standing on the porch in the cold. But what made the whole room go silent wasn't what my husband said. It was the 2 pieces of paper I set on the table first. "This table is for blood," Janet told me, smiling. She had no idea I'd been keeping the books. Welcome back to Revenge Range, where we sit with the quiet moments families try to bury, then follow them all the way to the truth. I'm Megan, I'm 34. I keep other people's books for a living, and I'd kept the peace in this family for 3 years. Not anymore. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. We live in Millbrook in a narrow blue house with a kitchen that never quite warms up. June's drawings cover the refrigerator edge to edge taped over the handle, so you have to peel one back to grab the milk. Greg is a calm man with sawdust permanently in his cuffs. He runs the floor at a cabinet shop 2 towns over. I married him 3 years ago when June was 4 and still called every man at the hardware store, sir. His 2 older kids, Tyler and Hannah, stay with us on weekends and half the summer. 12 and 10, all elbows and opinions. I love that house when it's full. I love it more when nobody's keeping score. Here's the thing, nobody had bothered to add up. I was the one keeping it running. I scheduled the dentist visits and the oil changes. I remembered which cousin was gluten-free and which one wasn't speaking to whom. When Greg's parents needed something, the request came to him and the money came from me quietly, the way I do most things. I'm not a martyr about it. I'm a bookkeeper. Tracking what goes out and what comes back is just how my brain rests. Every family has one person who keeps the lights on. In ours, that person was me. And not one of them had done the math on what that meant. I used to think that was fine. I used to think love was supposed to be invisible. That the best kind of giving left no fingerprints. That was my mistake, and it took a 7-year-old standing in a doorway to show me. You don't keep the peace by paying for it. You just teach people the peace is free. Sundays we drove the 25 minutes out to Cedar Hollow where Greg grew up. Janet keeps a clean house and a cold ledger. From the first dinner, she had a way of saying June's name that put a little space around it. "And how's Megan's girl?" she'd ask. Never our June. Never the baby. Tyler and Hannah got the good chair and the second helping. They got told they had the Walsh nose, the Walsh stubbornness, the Walsh everything. June got told to be careful on the stairs. The Christmas before, I watched Janet hand out gifts. Tyler and Hannah each had a stack. June had one small box, the kind you'd give a neighbor. I said something. Janet smiled and said, "Children shouldn't be spoiled." Roy, my father-in-law, studied his coffee. There's a refrigerator in that house too, and it is bare metal. Tyler's school photo lives on it. Hannah's ribbon from the science fair. Not one of June's drawings, though. She brought a fresh one every visit and pressed it into Janet's hands at the door. I find them later in the recycling, smooth flat, like Janet couldn't quite throw them out, but couldn't quite keep them either. Greg told me his mother came from people who measured worth in acres and last names. 5 generations on the same land before the bank took it. To Janet, blood wasn't sentiment. It was the only deed that couldn't be foreclosed. I understood her. That was the trouble. I understood her too well to hate her. And so I let it slide year after year, telling myself a child can't feel a temperature she's never been told to name. June felt it. She just didn't have the word yet. She kept asking me a question I couldn't answer. The question could wait. Roy's heart could not. 2 years back, his cardiologist put him on a fistful of pills and the co-pays alone ran close to $500 a month. Then the roof in Cedar Hollow gave out over the winter $6,000 to replace, more than they had. Roy's pension covers the basics and not much else. So the help started the way most help does, with one transfer I told myself was temporary. I covered the medication, then the groceries when the medication ate the grocery money, then the roof in installments, so it wouldn't show as one frightening number. Greg knew. Janet assumed it came from him, his shop wages, his good son's heart. I never corrected her. Correcting her would have meant a conversation, and conversations in that family came with a bill of their own. So I set up the payments and logged each one because logging things is what I do with my hands when my chest is tight. I never kept those records to use them. I want to be clear about that. I kept them the way I keep all my ledgers, because numbers are the one thing in that family that never lie and never change their story depending on who's in the room. A column of figures doesn't care whose nose you have. It just adds up. Month after month, it added up, and the total grew into a quiet, heavy thing I carried around without quite looking at. I could have told you the figure to the dollar at any moment. I just never said it out loud. There's a kind of giving that curdles when you keep it secret too long. It stops being generosity and starts being evidence. I didn't know that yet. I was about to learn it at a birthday party. Don't mistake my silence for softness. I'd drawn the line before more than once and watched it wash away. The first time I sat Janet down at our own table and told her plainly that June was my daughter and her grandchild, and that the cold shoulder stopped now. Janet folded her hands and said she treated all children the same. Then she asked if I brought the receipts for Roy's prescription. The second time I told Greg I was done funding a house where my kid ate last. I meant it. I had the bank app open, my thumb over the recurring transfer, ready to end it. That was the week Roy landed in the ER with chest pains. You can't shut off a man's heart medication to win an argument with his wife. So I closed the app. Greg asked me, quietly, to give his mother more time. He always asked for more time. He's a peacemaker, my husband. And peacemakers are wonderful until the day the peace they're keeping is built on your daughter's back. I gave it. I told myself Janet was old, that the prejudice would die with her generation, that I could outlast it with patience and a steady hand. I was wrong about the timeline. Hate doesn't get tired, it just waits for an audience. But I kept one thing for myself through all of it. A private sentence I'd say in the car on the way home while June slept in her booster seat. Love isn't blood, it's who shows up. I'd whisper it like a prayer I didn't fully believe yet. I showed up. I'd been showing up for 3 years in dollars and casseroles and silence. The showing up was about to stop being silent. There was something Janet didn't know. Something Greg and I had been building for the better part of a year. The spring before, Greg came home from work, sat on the edge of June's bed while she slept, and watched her a long while. Then he found me in the kitchen and said he wanted to make it real. Not stepdad, father on paper, in court. The kind that can't be argued at a dinner table. We hired a family attorney in the county seat. Because we'd been married over a year and June had lived under our roof since she was 4, the process moved without a contested hearing. Her biological father had signed away his rights long before I met Greg. There was no one to fight us. 6 weeks before the birthday, we drove to the courthouse in our good clothes. A judge with reading glasses asked Greg if he understood that adoption made June his child in every legal sense, his heir, his responsibility forever. No different from Tyler and Hannah. Greg said yes before the judge finished the sentence. June got to bang the little gavel. The clerk laughed. We have a photo of June mid-swing, mouth wide open, Greg's hand steadying her wrist. Her name is June Walsh now, not Megan's girl. Walsh. Like the nose, like the stubbornness, like the everything. We hadn't told the family. We were saving it. The way you save the best news for the moment, it lands hardest and kindest. Greg's birthday felt right. We pictured Janet's face softening. Finally, the paper doing what 3 years of casseroles couldn't. I kept the decree in a manila envelope, flat and official, and I brought it to the party folded in my bag. I told myself it was for the announcement. Part of me knew better. Janet announced she'd host the party herself, which was new. Usually I hosted and she critiqued. This year, she wanted it in Cedar Hollow. Her table, her rules, and Greg's sister Brenda would handle the details. Brenda is 40, recently divorced, and orbits her mother like a moon that's forgotten it used to have its own light. She moved back to the Hollow after the split, and made herself the keeper of the family's small treasures, the photo albums, the holiday china, the question of who sits where. I offered to cook the way I always did. I offered to bring the cake and cover the catering tray. Brenda said in that bright voice, that's really a closed door, that they wanted to keep it family this year. Let family handle the family things. I let it go. I always let it go. But I ordered the cake anyway because June had asked for the kind with the white frosting and the strawberries, and I wrote out the names for the baker to pipe on top. Greg, Megan, June, Tyler, Hannah, Janet, Roy, and Greg's sister, Brenda. 8 names across the top of that cake. 8. I remember thinking it was a good number, a full number, the number of a family that had grown instead of shrunk. On the phone, Brenda asked if we'd need a kids' table, then answered herself before I could. Probably not, she said. Probably the children could sort themselves out. I should have heard it then. The trap was already set. The chairs already counted in a house I didn't control. I was bringing a cake with 8 names to a table laid for 7. We drove out on a gray Saturday, the cake box belted into the middle seat like a third child. June wore the green dress she'd picked herself and held a rolled-up drawing on her lap the whole way. A surprise for Greg, she said. No peeking. Tyler and Hannah rode with us too. Fresh from their mothers, arguing about a video game and the easy way of kids who feel safe. Greg hummed. I watched the fields go by and felt for once almost hopeful. Today, we'd tell them. Today, the paper would speak. Janet met us at the door with a hug for Greg, a nod for Tyler and Hannah, and a there she is for June that didn't quite reach her eyes. The house smelled like pot roast and lemon polish. The dining room had been set with the good china, the cloth napkins, the heavy silver that only came out for blood occasions. I set the cake on the sideboard and did the thing I always do in a new room. I counted 7 chairs, 7 plates, 7 napkins, folded into little tents. I counted again because I'm a bookkeeper and the first count is never the one I trust. 7. Brenda came through with a picture and caught me looking. 1 had my mother's. 1 was my sister Gother's. Said, not meeting my eye, arranging the water glasses just so. Tyler had already flopped into a chair. Hannah claimed the one by the window that left by my arithmetic. Exactly enough seats for everyone at that table except 1. June stood in the doorway with her rolled-up drawing, looking at the grown-ups, looking at the chairs, doing the same small math I was doing, and arriving at the same cold answer. She didn't say anything. She just moved a little closer to my side. Before dinner, the neighbors came by, the Hadleys from down the road, to drop off a card for Greg. Janet lit up. She put a hand on Tyler's shoulder and one on Hannah's and presented them like exhibits. These are the grandchildren, she said. Tyler's going to play ball in high school. Can you believe the size of him? The Hadleys made the right noises. June stood 18 in the way, holding her drawing, smiling up, waiting to be introduced. She wasn't. Janet's hand never moved off Tyler's shoulder. The Hadleys said their goodbyes and didn't learn June's name because in that room, June didn't have one worth saying. June tugged my sleeve and asked me the question. The one she'd been circling for a year finally said out loud, quiet enough that only I could hear, Mommy, am I a grandkid too? I knelt down right there on Janet's polished floor. I told her yes. I told her she was somebody's whole world and a lot of people's grandkid, and that the people who couldn't see it were the ones missing out. She nodded the way kids do when they want to believe you and can't quite. Behind me, I heard Janet and Brenda in the kitchen, not bothering to lower their voices much. Brenda murmured something about the seating, about keeping it simple. And Janet said the thing she'd say twice more before the night was through. The sentence that became the spine of everything that happened. This table is for blood. June heard it. I watched it land on her. Watched her file it next to the bare refrigerator and the recycled drawings and the one small box at Christmas. She didn't cry. She just got very still the way I get still. And I understood for the first time exactly whose daughter she was. Greg missed all of it. That's the cruelty of these things. They happen in the corners, in the kitchen, in the half-second, when the good man is in the other room admiring a card. He was out on the porch with Roy and a neighbor talking gutters and ball games, the birthday boy being celebrated in the way he liked best, which was quietly. He didn't see Janet's hand stay put on Tyler's shoulder. He didn't hear the sentence. If I'd walked out and told him, he'd have come in and there'd have been a scene, and June would have learned that her belonging was something the adults had to fight about in front of company. I didn't want her to carry that. So I made a calculation, the kind I make all day with other people's money. I weighed the cost of waiting against the cost of erupting, and I chose to watch a little longer. I kept June close. I kept my bag closer. Inside it, flat against the lining, was the manila envelope, and beside the envelope was a second folder I'd printed the night before and told myself I wasn't really bringing. 3 years of transfers, dated, totaled, sorted by category. Medication, roof, groceries. I printed it at midnight while Greg slept, telling myself it was for my own records, for tax season, for any reason, but the real one. You don't bring your books to a birthday party unless some part of you already knows the party is going to become an audit. I stood in Janet's dining room with my daughter's hand in mine and a ledger in my bag, and I waited to see how far she would go. I didn't have to wait long. Dinner was ready. Janet called everyone to the table, and the table, I knew, had 7 chairs. While Janet carried the roast in, Brenda did the quiet work that makes cruelty look like logistics. She drifted over and suggested, all reasonableness, that June might be more comfortable in the den. There was a TV in there, she said, and a folding tray. And wouldn't a little girl rather watch cartoons than sit through grown-up talk? She framed it as a kindness. She always does. I said June was comfortable right here with her family. Brenda's smile tightened. She lowered her voice and got to the actual point, which was never about comfort. The photos, she said. After dinner, they were doing the family photos, the ones for the wall in the hallway, and Mom wanted those to be just the grandchildren. The real grandchildren, she said. And then caught herself and didn't take it back. I understood then that this wasn't Janet improvising. This was planned. The chair count, the den, the photos, the careful exclusion dressed as practicality. All of it decided before we walked in. Brenda glanced toward the kitchen, toward her mother, the way she's glanced at her all her life, checking she'd done the assignment right. Here's what I'd figured out about Brenda over 3 years. She wasn't cruel because she hated June. She was frightened. The divorce had left her with nothing of her own, and her mother's approval, her mother's house, her mother's eventual estate was the one inheritance she still felt entitled to. Every place set for my daughter felt to Brenda like a slice taken off her chair. So she counted chairs and policed photos and called it tradition. Janet appeared in the doorway with the roast and the carving knife. She looked at June, standing by my side exactly where June belonged, and I watched her decide that wouldn't do. "June, honey," she said, "come here a minute." Roy saw it coming before the rest of them. He'd come in off the porch and lowered himself into his chair at the head of the table, moving the careful way he moves since the heart trouble. He watched Janet set down the roast and called June over, and something crossed his face, something tired and ashamed. "Janet," he said. "She's just a little girl. Let her sit." It was the most he'd said on the subject in 3 years. For 1 second, I thought he might be the one to break it. Janet didn't even look at him. "Stay out of it, Roy. I'm handling the table." And he did. He stayed out of it. He picked up his fork and turned it over in his hand and looked at the cloth, and the small, brave thing in him folded back up and went quiet. I felt sorry for him, which annoyed me because feeling sorry for Roy had cost my daughter 3 years of cold dinners. Here is a man who knew better than anyone at that table who'd kept his prescriptions filled and his roof from caving in. He knew it wasn't his son's wages. He'd seen the same envelopes I had. And still, when his wife told him to sit down, he sat down because Janet's disapproval was a weather he'd spent 46 years learning to survive by not making any sudden moves. I didn't hate him for it, but I stopped excusing it. There's a difference between a man who does wrong and a man who watches wrong happen and decides his comfort is worth more than a child's. By the end of the night, Roy would finally say the thing that mattered. But he'd say it too late to be brave. He'd say it only after the numbers made silence impossible. Before Janet could steer her toward the den, June did the thing she'd planned the whole drive out. She crossed to Greg, who'd just come in from the porch, and she unrolled her surprise and held it up with both hands. "Happy birthday, Daddy." The room paused. It was a drawing of all of us, the way June draws, big heads and small bodies, and a yellow sun in the corner with a smile in it. 5 figures in a row holding hands. She'd labeled us in her careful first-grade letters. Mommy, Daddy, me, Tyler, Hannah. We were standing in front of the blue house in Millbrook, and everyone had the same enormous grin. Even Tyler, who in real life had not grinned since he turned 12. Greg took it like it was made of glass. He got down on one knee to be level with her and looked at it for a long moment, and I saw his jaw work. "This is the best present I've ever gotten," he said. And he meant it. Aunt June glowed. Janet behind them glanced at the drawing and her mouth did a small cold thing. "That's a nice drawing, sweetheart," she said in the voice you'd use for a stranger's child who'd handed you a dandelion. Then to the room, brisk. "All right, dinner's getting cold." She wanted the moment over. She wanted the 5-figure family folded up and put away, because a family of 5 with June in the middle of it was an argument against everything she'd built her table on. Greg rolled the drawing up gently and tucked it under his arm to keep it safe. He'd forget he was holding it later until the worst moment when it would fall. For now, it was just a birthday present from a girl to her father. The best one he'd ever gotten. June needed the bathroom before dinner, so I took her down the hall away from the noise. While she washed her hands, I dug in my bag for a tissue and the manila envelope came up with it and slipped out of my fingers onto the tile. It landed face up and slid open, and there it was, under the bathroom mite. The decree, heavy paper, the county seal pressed into the corner, the judge's signature in real ink, in the matter of the adoption of a minor child. June Walsh. Parent, Gregory Walsh. The word heir wasn't on the page, but I knew the law behind it. The attorney's plain explanation in his plain office. Finalized adoption makes the child a legal child in every sense. Inheritance, benefits, name. Everything Tyler and Hannah had by birth, June now had by order of the court, and no dinner table on earth could repeal it. I picked it up off Janet's bathroom floor and smoothed it flat against my thigh, the way I smooth every important paper, and I read it again, slower. June was drying her hands on the little guest towel that probably wasn't meant to be used. She didn't see my face. Good, because my face in that mirror had stopped being the face of a woman keeping the peace. I folded the decree back into the envelope, along a crease I now knew by heart. I made myself a quiet promise in that bathroom. The kind you don't take back. Tonight, if Janet put one hand on my daughter, this paper was going on her table, face up, in front of everyone. Not as a weapon, as a fact. The one had my on it. That didn't care whose nose you had. I slid the envelope back into my bag where it sat against the folder of 3 years of numbers. Fact beside fact, and I took June's hand and walked her back toward a table that did not want her. I keep books for a living. So, let me tell you what I told myself in that bathroom. Write down who shows up for your kids. Save it somewhere quiet. You may go your whole life and never need the list. But the night you finally do, you'll be glad the numbers are on your side and not just your memory. If you've ever kept a record like that, you already understand. Stay with me. It's about to matter. Dinner was called. Everyone moved toward the dining room and the choreography Janet and Brenda had rehearsed clicked into motion. Tyler and Hannah took their assigned chairs. Greg was waved toward the head of the table near Roy, and Brenda put her hand lightly on June's back and began to steer her away toward the den, toward the folding tray and the cartoons and the careful exile dressed up as a treat. "Come on, sweetie, you get the special spot," Brenda said. June looked back at me, confused, her feet dragging on the rug. I was already moving, but at that exact moment, Greg had ducked into the kitchen to carry out the cake I'd brought, the one with 8 names. And so he had his back turned and his hands full, and he didn't see his sister walking his daughter toward a different room. I crossed the dining room. Before I could reach them, Janet intercepted. She stepped between me and June with the ease of a woman who'd spent a lifetime managing rooms, and she put her own hand on June's shoulder over Brenda's and turned my daughter gently but firmly toward the hall. "The children who belong at this table will sit at it," she said, pleasant as anything for the whole room to hear. "June can eat in the den. It's nicer for her. She'll be more comfortable." The word comfortable again. The kindest sounding cruelty there is. The table went quiet. Tyler stopped mid-sentence. Hannah looked at her grandmother. then at June, then down at her plate. Roy set his fork on the cloth. I felt the whole night narrow to a single point, the way a column of figures narrows to one total at the bottom, and I heard my own voice come out level and clear. The voice I use when a client's numbers don't add up. And I already know why she's staying at this table. Janet turned to face me fully, and her pleasantness hardened into something she'd been wanting to say for 3 years. Megan, let the real children sit with their father tonight. It's his birthday. Her hand stayed on June's shoulder, holding her in place, pointed toward the door. June can have her supper in the den. There's no shame in it. She's just not. And she paused and chose the cruelest possible honesty. She's not his. Not really. Everyone here knows it. I'm not going to pretend at my own table. There it was, out loud in front of Tyler and Hannah and Roy in the rolled-up drawing under Greg's arm in the next room. June stood frozen under her grandmother's hand. She didn't understand all the words, but she understood the shape of them, the way a child always understands when an adult is making them small. Brenda hovered, complicit, ready to walk her off. And Janet, sensing the room wobble, reached for her anchor, the sentence she trusted, the deed that couldn't be foreclosed. This table is for blood. 3 times now I'd heard it. Once in the kitchen, once to the name on it, now to my face with my child pinned beneath her hand. I want to tell you, I planned what came next, that the bookkeeper had run the scenario and chosen the optimal move. I hadn't. I just knew. The way, the floor is there in the dark. That the years of letting it go were over. My hand went into my bag. My fingers found the manila envelope, then the folder behind it. I didn't raise my voice. I've never won anything by raising my voice, but I took one step toward the table and Janet, misreading me, decided to make her point with more than words. She moved June toward the door. It happened fast, the way the worst things do. June planted her small feet because she didn't want to go because everything in her was telling her to stay near her mother. And Janet, impatient now, performing her authority for the table, gave her a push. Not a shove that would bruise, a push that said, "You are a thing I can move." A push toward the front door and the cold porch beyond it, as if my daughter were a draft to be shut out. June stumbled. Her hand flew out and caught the door frame, and the drawing, the one Greg had tucked under his arm and forgotten, slid loose in the commotion and dropped to the floor between them. All 5 of us holding hands face up on Janet's hardwood. Nobody spoke. The whole room had gone the particular silence of people who've just watched a line get crossed and don't yet know who's going to do something about it. Hannah's eyes filled. Tyler stood up so fast his chair scraped. Roy half rose and sat back down. And June, my still and careful girl, looked at the drawing on the floor and then up at me. Not crying yet, just waiting. The way she'd waited her whole short life for an adult to fix the thing she couldn't name. I crossed the room. That was the second mistake Janet made that night. The first was thinking a 7-year-old was the easiest person in that house to move. The second was thinking I'd kept 3 years of records for nothing. I reached my daughter, and I put myself between her and the door. And somewhere behind me in the kitchen doorway, I heard the cake plate touch the counter as Greg finally turned around and saw the room he'd walked back into. I knelt and picked up the drawing first. I don't know why that was the order my body chose, but it was the paper before anything else, smoothing it the way I smooth all the important papers. Then I stood and I picked June up onto my hip, though she's really too big for it now, and I set her down again behind me where the door couldn't reach her. I put my hand flat on her back so she'd feel it through her green dress. Steady, present, here, and I straightened up to my full height between my daughter and her grandmother. I didn't shout. I want you to picture the opposite of shouting. I looked Janet in the eye and I said it slowly enough that every person in that room caught each word. Don't you ever put your hands on my child again. Janet blinked. She wasn't used to being addressed at her own table in a voice that didn't rise and didn't shake. People who rule by temperature don't know what to do with someone who's gone cold instead of hot. I'm her grandmother, she started. And I cut her off, still quiet. You're going to want to think very carefully about the next thing you say. Brenda had backed against the sideboard. Tyler had come around the table to stand near June and me, 12 years old and furious, and not entirely sure what he was furious about. Only that his grandmother had pushed his little sister, and that was wrong. In a way, his body understood before his words did. The drawing was in my hand. The envelope was in my bag. And 3 years of every casserole I'd carried into that house, every prescription I'd quietly covered, every drawing I'd found smoothed flat in the recycling, sat up in my chest at once and became finally a single clear total. I was done keeping the peace. Greg stood in the kitchen doorway with frosting on his thumb and the birthday candles still in their box, and he read the room the way you read a car crash. All at once and too late. June behind me, eyes wet, the drawing in my hand, his mother's arm still half raised toward the front door. His sister pressed against the sideboard, his father staring at the tablecloth. He's not a fast man, my husband. He's a measure twice, cut once man. So he didn't roar in. He set the cake plate down on the counter very, very carefully. The way you set something down when your hands have started to shake and you don't want anyone to see. I'd never watched him do anything that slowly. One happened, he said, not loud, flat, like mine. And the Hadley's card stood on the sideboard, wishing him a happy birthday while his mother decided how much of the truth to admit. Nothing happened, Janet said. I asked June to eat in the den, and Megan made a production of it. Tyler's voice cracked across the room before I could answer. Grandma pushed her. She pushed June into the door. A 12-year-old will tell the truth in a room full of adults who've agreed to lie. God bless him for it. Hannah nodded fast, backing her brother. Greg looked at his son, at his daughter, at the drawing he suddenly realized he'd dropped. The one had my bonnet. June had handed him 20 minutes ago, the best present he'd ever gotten, now creased from the floor. Something settled in his face. Not rage, something quieter and far more final. The look of a man recalculating every Sunday dinner of the last 3 years and arriving at a number he should have run a long time ago. He walked around the table and stood beside me in front of June, and he said, "Tell me exactly what my mother just did." Janet should have stopped. A wiser woman or a less frightened one would have read her son's face and pulled back, but Janet had built her whole life on a single principle. And when you've staked everything on one idea, you defend it past all sense, because the alternative is admitting the foundation was rotten the whole time. So she dug. "Oh, don't you start, Gregory. Somebody in this family has to be honest. That child is not yours. You took on Megan's daughter. Fine, that was your choice. But don't ask the rest of us to rewrite the bloodline because you've got a soft heart." Her voice climbed. "Your real children, Tyler and Hannah, they're Walshes. They'll have this house someday, this land. What's left of it? I won't sit here and watch you hand it to a stranger's kid playing dress-up at my table." The word stranger hit Greg like a slap. Brenda, sensing her mother needed reinforcement, found her voice. "Mom's right, Greg. Blood is blood. You can't just decide." "I did decide," Greg said, quiet still. But the temperature in the room had inverted. Janet was hot now, flushed and rising. Greg had gone cold like me. The two of us standing in front of June radiating the kind of calm that frightens people more than any yelling. Roy looked up from the tablecloth, finally his old face gray. He knew what was coming, or he knew something was, because he'd seen the same envelopes I had, and he understood that a reckoning long deferred was about to arrive at his wife's table with the roast still steaming. I felt June's hand fist into the back of my dress. I felt the envelope in my bag. And I decided it was time to stop letting them argue about whether my daughter was real and start showing them exactly who in that room had been carrying the family all along. Here's the thing about keeping the peace for 3 years. You teach everyone around you that the peace is free. It isn't. Somebody is always paying for it in money, in silence, in a child learning to stand a little closer to the door. If you've ever been the one quietly paying so everyone else can pretend the family is fine, this next part is for you. Comment. I see it and keep watching. The total's about to come due. I looked down at June, at her green dress and her wet eyes and her stubborn Walsh chin that the court had made official 6 weeks ago, whether Janet liked it or not. Then I looked at Greg, and he gave me the smallest nod because after 3 years, he knew the look on my face. The look I get when the books are finally going to be opened in front of everyone. 3 years of letting it go ended in that nod. I reached into my bag. The room watched my hand the way you watch a magician. Not knowing the trick, but knowing one's coming. I took out the manila envelope first. I didn't slam it down. I didn't make a speech. I just walked to the table to the empty place where June's chair should have been, and I started talking in the even voice I use for clients who've made a mess and need to hear the truth without flinching. Janet, for 3 years I've sat at your table and listened to you decide who counts. I let it go because Greg asked me to, and because I thought you'd come around, and because I keep the peace. I set the envelope on the cloth. I'm not keeping it anymore. Love isn't blood, Janet, it's who shows up. Let me show you who's been showing up. I slid the first paper out and laid it face up on the table, turned so she could read it, the county seal catching the light. The room leaned in. Brenda craned. Roy put on the glasses that hung around his neck. And Janet, who had just finished announcing to a room full of witnesses that my daughter was a stranger playing dress-up, looked down at the heavy paper with the judge's signature on it, and began slowly to understand what she was reading. That's a court order, I said. 6 weeks ago, in front of a judge, Greg adopted June. It's finalized. It's done. Her name is June Walsh. I let it sit there a second so the seal could do its work. By law, she is his daughter, not his stepdaughter. His daughter. Full stop. The same as Tyler and the same as Hannah, which makes her your granddaughter, Janet, and his heir. Exactly. Equally his heir with the same claim to this house and this land you were just promising to the others. Janet's hand went to the edge of the table. You can't just. We did. A judge signed it. There's nothing to argue and no one to argue with, because June's father gave up his rights years ago and Greg stood up in that courtroom and took them on purpose, because that's what showing up looks like when you put it on paper. I watched the color leave her face for the first time. She'd spent the whole night, the whole 3 years standing on a single idea, blood. And here was the state of the law telling her that the word she'd weaponized had been redefined right under her. That the little girl she'd just pushed toward the porch had more legal right to that house than the daughter she'd been grooming as her ally. Tyler, reading over Roy's shoulder, broke into a grin. So June's really our sister now? Like for real, real? She was always your sister? Greg said. Now the law agrees. Hannah reached across and took June's hand. And June, who hadn't said a word since the doorway, looked at the paper with her name on it and then at me, and something in her small face uncreased. But I wasn't finished. Janet had called my daughter a stranger and a freeloader in the same breath. And there was a second paper in my bag, and the second one wasn't about June at all, it was about Janet. And that, I said, is only the first piece of paper. I took out the folder. I laid it next to the decree and I opened it to the summary page. The one with the categories down the left and the totals across the bottom. 3 years of my handwriting and my arithmetic. You said this table is for blood. I said, let's talk about who's been keeping the blood fed. I touched the first line. Roy's heart medication every month for 2 years, about $500 a month, because that's what the copays run and his pension doesn't cover it. I moved my finger down the roof. The winter it caved. $6,000 paid in installments so it wouldn't frighten anybody. Groceries when the medication ate the grocery money, the water heater, the property taxes twice. I turned the page so she could see the running total at the bottom. Underlined twice the way I underline every figure that matters, just under $40,000, Janet over 3 years, and not $1 of it came from Greg's wages. I let that land. It came from me, from the bookkeeper, from the Sturs' kid's mother. I've been paying to keep this house warm the whole time you've been deciding my daughter doesn't belong in it. The silence had weight now. Brenda's mouth had come open. And Roy, gray-faced Roy, who had stayed out of it his whole life, looked at his wife and said the thing he should have said years ago, the words that mattered most. Janet, it's all true. He'd known. Of course he'd known. He'd watched his prescriptions get filled and his roof get fixed by money his wife refused to see. And he'd said nothing because saying something meant facing what it meant. Now he said it too late to be brave. just in time to be honest. Janet stared at the total, at her husband, at the daughter she'd called a stranger whose mother had been carrying her household for 3 years, without a word, and the foundation she'd built her whole table on, cracked clean down the middle. Janet did the only thing left to a person whose argument has just collapsed. She got loud. She snatched the napkin off her lap and threw it on the table. And her voice cracked up into something raw and shrill that I'd never heard from her in 3 years of cold control. How dare you? How dare you bring money into my home at my son's birthday? This is exactly the kind of thing you think you can buy your way into being family. You think a checkbook makes that child blood? She was on her feet now, both hands flat on the cloth, leaning toward me, red to the hairline. Brenda reached for her arm and Janet shook her off. Get that paper off my table. Get it off. This is my house. This is my family, and I will decide who sits at this table. I didn't move. I didn't raise my voice. That's the part I want you to hear because it's the only part that ever wins. The louder she got, the quieter I got until the gap between us was the whole story. I'm not raising my voice, Janet, I said. I don't need to. The numbers already did. I rested my hand flat on the folder. And I didn't bring money into this. You did. You brought it in the day you decided some children eat at the table, and some children eat by the door. I just wrote down what it cost. She opened her mouth, and nothing came out. There's a specific silence that lands on a person who has always controlled the room and just lost it in front of everyone she controls. Roy was looking at her like he was seeing her plain for the first time. Tyler had his arm around June. Hannah was crying quietly. And Greg, who had stood beside me through all of it without a word, finally set June's drawing down on the table between the decree and the ledger, smoothed it flat, and stepped forward to speak. Greg put his finger on the drawing on the 5 figures holding hands on the word Daddy in June's careful letters. He looked at his mother and then at his father, and he spoke in the low, even voice he'd handed down to his daughter, without either of them knowing it. You pushed my daughter out the door. He let that sit. My daughter, I sat in a courtroom 6 weeks ago and swore to be her father for the rest of my life. And tonight at my own birthday in my mother's house, you put your hands on her and shoved her toward the cold like she was nothing. His jaw worked once. So here's what happens now. We are going to walk out of that door together. All 5 of us, the family in this drawing. And the check stopped tonight. Every dollar that's kept this house warm came from the woman you just humiliated and the child you just called a stranger. If June isn't family mother, then neither is the money. You can't have it both ways. You don't get to feed off this family and spit on half of it at the same time. Janet went white, not pale. White, the color of someone watching the ground open. Roy made a small sound and put his hand over his eyes. Brenda sat down hard in the chair she'd guarded so carefully. The inheritance she'd been policing all night suddenly revealed as a house her brother's wife had been quietly keeping afloat. Janet reached out one hand toward Greg, toward the only son who'd ever protected her from the consequences of herself. And for the first time in his life, he didn't take it. Happy birthday to me, he said almost gently. I'm spending it with my family. He picked the drawing up off the table and the decree, and he handed me the folder, and he reached down and lifted June into his arms. His parents sat there, gone pale and silent, the roast cooling between them. The 7 careful place settings suddenly looking like exactly what they were. We didn't storm out. Storming out is for people who haven't already won. We gathered our things the way you leave any dinner, except quieter, the whole room watching. Greg carried June on his hip, her face tucked into his neck. I picked up the folder in the envelope and slid them back into my bag. Fact beside fact. And then Tyler did the thing I'll remember longest. He stood up from the table he'd been told all his life was his by right. Looked at his grandmother and said, "She's our sister. If June can't sit here, I don't want to either." Then he walked over and took June's hand, the one that wasn't fisted in Greg's collar. Hannah followed her brother without a word, the way she follows him everywhere. And just like that, the 2 real grandchildren had voted with their feet and Janet's whole bloodline had picked the Sturses' kid. We walked to the door. All 5 of us, the same front door Janet had tried to push June through an hour earlier. We went out it together, on our own feet. The cold porch air sharp and clean after the heat of that room. Behind us, nobody spoke. Brenda didn't follow. Roy half rose again and sat again, his last small failure of the night. And Janet stood at the head of her perfect table with her perfect china and her 7-place settings, the carving knife still in her hand, watching the family she'd spent 3 years sorting into real and not real walk out her door as one unsorted whole. The drawing was safe under Greg's arm. The decree was in my bag. And June, halfway to the car, lifted her head off her father's shoulder and looked back at the house. Not sad, just done the way I get done. And I knew whose daughter she was all over again. In the car halfway home down the dark county road, June finally spoke. "Did I do something wrong?" Greg answered before I could, his eyes on the road and his voice rough. "No, you did everything right just by being you." She fell asleep before the highway, the way kids do after they've held it together longer than they should have to. The check stopped that week. I closed the recurring transfers I'd set up 3 years ago, and the quiet money that had kept Cedar Hollow warm went quiet for good. I'm not a cruel person. Whatever Janet decided that night, Roy's heart is still bad. And I won't punish an old man's arteries for his wife's pride. So, I set up something new. A direct line to the pharmacy that covers his essential medication only, paid straight to them. Nothing that passes through Janet's hands or pays for her version of family. It comes with a condition in writing because I write everything down. The day she's willing to call June her granddaughter and mean it, we'll talk about the rest. Until then, the den door stays open the only way that matters, which is from our side. Roy called once alone and said he was sorry in the cracked voice of a man who knows sorry is a down payment on a debt he can't fully pay. Janet hasn't called. Brenda hasn't either. The hallway in Cedar Hollow still has its wall of grandchildren, and June's photo will never hang there, and that's their loss to live with now. Not my daughters. Our refrigerator in Millbrook is still covered edge at edge with her drawings. And last week, she added a new one taped right over the handle. 5 figures holding hands in front of a blue house. She labeled it the same as always. Mommy, Daddy, me, Tyler, Hannah. She started signing them too. June Walsh. Blood decides who you're related to, but showing up decides who your family is. And I've learned to keep very good records of exactly who shows up. June still draws our family with 5 people holding hands. The aches plate, the brown envelope, the door Janet held open. In the end, only for herself. If someone in your life keeps score of who's real, show them who shows up instead. Share this with a mother who's had to stand her ground in a doorway. Comment who shows up below and subscribe to Revenge Range. We'll keep the door open. We'll keep the books. We'll see you next time.